Hi, hello. It has been made clear to me by the sheer volume of mid-year recap videos that I have seen so far that it is indeed the middle of the year. Wild to think, but that is true. It is June, and so I'd just like to go through some of the books that I've read so far this year. I have not read a ton. I have read 29, but given that my yearly goal was to read 20, I am feeling quite happy with that. What I'm hoping to do is to do a tier ranking, and this is my custom tier ranking based very much on the sort of things that I read in in great quantity. So I will be putting each book that I've read on a tier list, which goes from 4 different tiers. The first one is, of course, Put It in My Veins. This is for books that I absolutely loved. Basically, that is a big yes for those books. I'll Bite is the next tier down, and those are for books that I kind of liked. Maybe I had some issues with, or they're just not really like super my taste. Not My Cup of Blood is the next tier, and that's for ones that both aren't my taste and I had issues with them. There were definitely problems I found. And then the bottom tier, which is basically my version of no, is the skull emoji. And yeah, for me, that's books that I regret reading, and I don't really recommend if you have tastes that are similar to mine, at least. And I will say that I've read 29 books, but I will be talking about 28 of them. One is a non-fiction sort of writing craft book, which feels weird to put it on this ranking scale. I'll be ranking all of the fiction books that I've read so far this year. Of the ones I've read, the most reviewed on Goodreads is, of course, The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. And, you know, that's no surprise. But yeah, that has a truly wild amount of reviews. The least reviewed is Will It Hurt by Lily X, which makes sense because that's one that I found through Kickstarter. It's a self-published novel, and I'd recommend it, but we'll talk about that later. The highest rated are Will It Hurt, but that, I mean, it has under 100 reviews, so that kind of inches up the rating. The Poppy War and Heartless Hunter by Kristen Ciccarelli. The oldest one that I've read is Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, the novella from 1872. And I've read multiple 2025 releases. To keep this from being an entirely selfish endeavour, I will be doing a brief description of each of the books. I will give my thoughts as to who would enjoy the book, and then I will put it in my tier ranking, of course. So we'll start with the heavy hitter that is The Poppy War. It's very much a coming of age story following a poor girl who tests into an elite academy, a military academy. So we see her struggles through being accepted, learning about her history and the gods that exist in this world, which is inspired by Chinese history, I think in the 20th century. And she also needs to control her powers before she is brought into the war. I think I'd recommend this for those who want an epic fantasy, but also I think there's some dispute about whether or not it's YA or new adult, because there's quite serious subject matter, particularly around the war. But yeah, you still spend a lot of time with her education, teenage school environment, which to me skews a little bit more younger, but I guess it is just the standard coming of age story. So for me, and for those who've read it, this is probably a wild thing to say, but I kind of felt like I liked the story a lot, like I liked elements of it, but it almost needed more stakes, which again is a wild thing to say, but there were just a few times where you think people have died and then they actually haven't. And that's just a real bugbear for me, is when it's revealed that like you had the emotional payoff of someone dying and then it's like pulled away from you. So I just, you know, in my mind, I'm like, just let people stay dead sometimes. But on the whole, I think this one has to be top tier. So another popular one that I read this year was Heartless Hunter, which is about a witch who is living at a time where, or a time and place where witches are executed, and she's working undercover to save other witches. And she is known as the Crimson Moth. I think in Australia it went by the title Crimson Moth, but then in other countries it's Heartless Hunter. But it's also a romance where she is attracted to the witch hunter who is her long-term friend's older brother. So there's a lot of tropes, but it is quite a fun ride. I think sometimes like trope heavy stuff is just, it is enjoyable for a reason. So I recommend this for the fantasy or romantasy people who don't really want to think about it too hard, because the implications of what he is actually doing, like his murders, are not, I would say, not really justified. You can't really be justified in being a witch hunter in that world, I think. But it's fun. And I would put it at the I'll bite level. Lightfall is an epic fantasy following a group of various fantasy creatures in a world where vampires are confined to a particular city, and are at the threat of these unknown beings known as the Greys. And I think this one is for people who like the D&D group dynamic adventure style of fantasy. I enjoyed it, but it's also not really my genre. Like, I usually read either darker fantasy or romantasy, probably. So for this one to be kind of, I guess, standard epic fantasy, in my mind, that's what I think of it. I know that genres are like more mutable than that, but in my head, that's where I put it. Like, it felt different to me reading it, but it's also not one that has super stuck with me. Except that I really liked the werewolf assassin. She was one of the fun characters that you get to be in the head of. So for this one is, I think it's I'll Bite. Yeah, I'll Bite. Skyshade is the third book in a series of incredibly hyped romantasy books. The first two, honestly, I read them so quickly, and it was very much like a brain off, just enjoy it, read it again incredibly quickly. But this book, Skyshade, was absolutely a drag, and it had so little plot to justify the length of the book. I don't know how much to say about it, given that it is the third book in a series in terms of like what actually happens, and virtually I think everyone has heard of it at this point. But I would just say, like, I wouldn't recommend this, except I guess for people like me who read the first two books and have like a bit of a completionist streak. But I wish I'd never read the series, honestly. This is Skull tier for sure, and it definitely has put me off reading the rest. Book of Night by Holly Black. This one has a really interesting premise. It's about a thief, like con artist woman, who is in a world where shadows take on their own sort of magical energy, where they can be manipulated and at times like actually separate from people and have their own like physicality to do horrible things. It was also a shockingly slow story, and it really lingered on some of the most boring facets of this world, including, unfortunately, the protagonist herself. I would recommend it for people who have patience and want to try something, I guess, sort of new in the urban fantasy sphere. Like, I think the concept of the shadows is really interesting. There are aspects of this like underground con artist world that feel like they should be interesting. So I can't tell anyone not to give it a go. But that being said, I also really can't recommend it for people who share my interests. This is going in the lowest tier, unfortunately. Immortal Dark. This is a book for those who like chaos and for characters that don't always make the most sense, but you're on board for the wild ride. In this, the protagonist must go to a university where vampires and humans coexist, and they're sort of linked according to particular family units. And the protagonist must also stay in the home that she's inherited, the family home, with a vampire in order to keep the house and to find her missing sister. I spent a long time ranting about this book in another video, and so I'll simply say that it wasn't for me, but I definitely appreciated some of the things that it was doing and trying, but this will be a not my cup of blood tier ranking. So Thirsty is a book about, well, it's kind of mainly about a friendship. We follow a woman whose friend invites her to a party when they're on like a girls' trip, and that party does happen to involve vampires, and things kind of escalate from there. It does have a fun premise, and it was cool to follow a story with a slightly older protagonist in a fantasy or paranormal setting, and it's got like a complicated friend dynamic, which I think was compelling, even if the characters themselves are quite frustrating, or in particular, the protagonist was quite frustrating to be in her head. There is also a romance, but it takes a backseat, and I think it really should have taken even more of a backseat, to be honest. It is for people who like that sort of toxic female friendship dynamic and almost like a found family aspect as well. But for me, it falls into not my cup of blood. So A Cruel Thirst is another of the hunter versus magical creature romance pairings, which I always love. So this is a story of a teenager who was recently turned into a vampire, trying to save his sister from his sire and find answers as to the origins of vampires in this particular town, where we also have our other protagonist, who is a teenager raised in a family of vampire hunters. And she in particular wants to be like a really well-regarded vampire hunter, to be the protector of her family. And I think this one had like a fresh perspective while also staying true to the core aspects of vampire stories. I'd recommend it for people who like that and also who want like a kind of sweet, fun vampire romance. It's kind of in between I'll buy it and put it in my veins, but I think I'm tipping more towards put it in my veins because I thought it was really, I don't know, it was kind of refreshing. Lucy Undying is a Dracula sequel retelling that is definitely, it definitely offers its own take and is not one, I think, for the Dracula purists. It follows Lucy, who is the character from Dracula, as she becomes a vampire and her relationship with herself, other vampires, and a woman in the present day whose life is sort of entangled with Lucy's in interesting ways, as Lucy tries to escape and or destroy her sire. So I think this is one for people like me, exactly like me, who like a sapphic vampire story and like to really root for a vampire lady just doing her thing and killing people who are bad and loving and living and everything else. Yeah, this one's top tier for me. And so as we move into the horror, I'd have to start with Camilla. Camilla is a classic gothic novella which follows a young woman who suddenly has a guest in the form of Camilla, a strange yet alluring young-looking woman too, and they become sort of very intertwined and infatuated with each other. But the protagonist starts to get nightmares and becomes ill, and, you know, it's a vampire story, so you kind of know where that is heading. Not a surprise, this is top tier for me as well. It is a queer vampire story. I don't know, I think I'm always going to put those pretty highly. So I recommend it for people who also like that, but also for those who want to kind of dip their toe into classics but are a bit scared maybe, because this one is pretty accessible and it's like short. It's a novella. I think like 100 pages or something like that. Okay, so Blood on Her Tongue. Yet more vampires, yet more gothicness. This is probably my favourite book of the year so far. So it is like a vampire story, but it also has kind of a weirder and more gory interpretation. This is a story about two sisters who are twins and what happens after one of them encounters this woman who's been left and seemingly murdered in this bog. And after she has that sort of encounter, she becomes increasingly more ill and strangely behaved. The vibes in this story, I think, are incredible. I would recommend it to those who love stories about sisterhood, but with like a touch of body horror. This is in the put it in my veins camp yet again. Hide is another horror book with a sapphic romance happening. It is, I think, probably more of a thriller potentially, but it follows a group of individuals who are convinced to go on a reality show that involves hiding out in an abandoned amusement park during the day. But then each day, as they meet up at night, they discover that people are eliminated and the game is suspiciously deadly seeming. So I think this one is for people who like a kind of, I almost want to call it like a B movie style. Like it's not, I don't know. I want to say that this story is camp, but I don't know that it actually falls into that. But it has that B movie style, like just a fun horror about a creepy amusement park and family curses. So for me, this fits in the I'll bite category for sure. So dipping into the YA horror space, I also read I Feed Her to the Beast and the Beast is Me, which is a very long title for a book. And this one is about a ballerina. She is the kind of only black ballerina in her academy, and she is quite good at it. She sacrificed a lot to get to her position, but she is not as regarded as the white ballerinas. And one day she happens to find I don't know what to call it even. It's this kind of substance in the ground that seems to have this tie with a demon who has the power to give her powers. I think that even if this wasn't my favorite, I'd still put it in albeit because it had an interesting concept that was good enough to me that it is albeit. I'd recommend for people who like Black Swan, but not as like tight and intense as Black Swan, like a bit of a sillier Black Swan, honestly, but also with racism. All right, so The Creeper was the first book that I read this year, and I read that on the basis of watching The Watchers, which is a horror movie based on one of A.M. Shine's books. It sounds like the superior book because a lot of the opinions I was seeing about The Creeper suggested that The Watchers is better. I didn't particularly enjoy The Creeper. I liked parts of it, but it's also very much like you start in one place and then the place you end up does not make any sense. So we follow mainly the guy, but we follow a man and a woman who get hired to go to this remote Irish village and learn a little bit more about the history of the town, and in particular this kind of myth around something called the Creeper. And the person that hired them is this kind of rich man that they don't know much about in a very, very locked down house who has seemingly adjusted his life to account for the story that has been created around this creature, which is essentially that like you see it a couple of times and the next time you see it, you're dead. So this person has lived his life around that belief and has sent these researchers to go and find out more. It has a cool idea. Again, it's like, I read stories because they have cool ideas usually, and then I am occasionally disappointed in how they execute those ideas. And in this instance, it was one that the ending really just was very frustrating with the rest of what you kind of see and encounter in the story. It doesn't feel like it makes sense. And the protagonist is kind of a little bit of a misogynist, and I don't know that you're supposed to think that, but he has like a very old school style of like, I'm just gonna like minorly perv on my coworker, and I don't know that you're supposed to think that's creepy or weird, but I think it's creepy. I guess I would recommend this for people who want a story about a creepy village that doesn't necessarily have the best payoff. But you're just like, you're in it when you're in that village. You're like, you're happy enough to read just, I guess, that part of it. And it has like a little bit of suspense, but yeah. I put this in the not my cup of blood. The only other book I think that I've read from a male author this year, also a story about a misogynistic man, although this was more overtly. This is 1922 by Stephen King. And this one is a man who kills his wife with the assistance of his young son in the middle of nowhere in farmland in 1922. And then we follow kind of the descent into madness as he is haunted by his decisions, and it gets a little bit gross, and there's some rats involved, and yeah, it's a little bit gnarly. I think that despite being in the head of a really shitty dude, this wasn't a bad read. This was like a novella as well, so it was quite short. I'd still put it in not my cup of blood, but it's not awful. I think I might check out the movie at some point. Oh, and I'd recommend it for people who like short, creepy little stories about bad husbands suffering the consequences of their actions. Another novella that I read this year is The Salt Grows Heavy, and this is quite an interesting one. Much more literary, like the language is quite I don't know if flowery is the word, but it uses some big words for sure. And I didn't really mind it. I think if it was a full-length novel, I might have gotten sick of it, but the language, it made sense as well with the point of view we're in, which is of a kind of murderous mermaid who has acclimatized to being on land after taking down her husband, this king. She goes off with a plague doctor. Then it's kind of about their adventure as they encounter a society where children are systematically murdered for the sake of this ritual. As you can tell, it's quite gory. It is not a super pleasant novel in that regard, but it's also like, I don't know, a little bit uplifting. Like, the relationship between the mermaid and the plague doctor is nice. She is quite violent and she doesn't think in clear moral ways, but the relationship that she has and the way she feels for the plague doctor is a nice entryway into this person's head and feeling for her and for them, the plague doctor. And then, yeah, there's just some like creepy kid stuff too. So I would recommend this for people who are not afraid of big words, but like it's described as like a dark fairy tale. And I think a queer dark fantasy that's a little bit bloody. I think I'd put it in my veins. Like, I'd definitely read more of that. The other novella that I read is Bloom, which is a romance between it feels weird to call it that, which is kind of ostensibly set up as a bit of a rom-com premise where this girl, she's very, she's a little bit insufferable in how optimistic she is, but she's very much like, everything is destined and I'm going to go to the farmer's market and everything is beautiful and isn't love grand. And she falls for a woman who is working at the farmer's market, selling cupcakes and plants and things like that. And as she grows closer to this woman, she discovers that she has like a self-sustaining farm where she makes all her own butter and urns or, whatever, like pottery. She is very kind of self-sustaining on this property that she lives in by herself in the middle of nowhere. So you have them kind of growing closer and then weird shit starts to happen. Now, I think that given that this is in the horror category, something's going to happen. And I think as you read it, it's pretty clear fairly early on what that is going to be. But I think it was still pretty fun. I mean, I think I listened to the audiobook and I think it was about 6 hours. It went by really fast for me. I've seen people say that it's like she's very insufferable, the protagonist, and it's hard to accept some of her stuff. But I think, in my mind, I think she's supposed to be. Like, the way that I read it is that you're supposed to think that, yeah, okay, this person is a red flag, but she is also a red flag herself. Like, they're just two toxic people in very different ways that kind of merge together. So... I guess the other thing is that, like, it takes a while to get to that point. So I think this might be another one where you maybe need a little bit of patience. But again, it's a novella, so, like, not that much patience. But you are, like, equally willing to listen to or read a developing relationship story about kind of toxic people as you are willing to hear some kind of gross shit. Because that's what Bloom is. And I think a perfect lead in now to my actual romance books. And the first one I want to talk about is the first one that I read this year, which is Dark Restraint by Katie Robert. Unfortunately, I have loved some of the books in this series in the past, which is it's like a smutty version of Greek gods in this weirdly political, kind of semi-magical world. It's very confusing in that way. A few in this series that I've absolutely loved. This was not one of them. This one, it definitely moved the overarching plot along in terms of the politics, but the romance between these two, kind of bodyguard, overbearing, like you're mine type, but in a way that didn't feel justified, with a woman who was like struggling with emotional abuse from her family and needing to like escape the situation. And so, I don't know, to me the connection was just terrible and it didn't feel like she wanted him as much as he wanted her. And that's a really weird way to have a story like this go, with the kind of power dynamics in play. But because of the series, like as a whole, I think I would recommend this for people who have read the other ones and kind of need the plot points in it. Yeah, you need to know what's happening. And like some people don't mind the whole like very let's say dominant personality, not just in the bedroom, but like in every aspect of life. And I think maybe you'd enjoy it for that. But yeah, because it had some of the plot, I think I'd say it's not my cup of blood. It's not bad enough to get the skull, but it is, if it was just the romance without the other politics side of things, it would definitely be the skull. So Will It Hurt by Lily X is the first book that I've ever picked up from a Kickstarter, which is something I somehow didn't know anything about until it came up on my Instagram, and then I realized I had to buy it because of the premise. So it's a witch and vampire pairing, and it's about a witch whose job it is to basically assist vampires to die when they've kind of made that call for themselves. She is apprehensive about the job that she's inherited. Then she also runs into the vampire love interest, who is looking for her progeny, who is one of the vampires that volunteered to die. So they work together to bring back this vampire, to work out if that is actually what this vampire wanted or whether it had to do with something their sire commanded. It's a whole big thing. It's an emotional story, but it's also smutty as hell. So this is actually, I would say this is put it in my veins level. And for those that like that sort of the paranormal pairing of witch and vampire, and also like a dominant vampire lady, you will like this story, I think. While we're talking smut, I also read 3 books from the same author in the last month. I really just, I got hooked in a weird way. The first one was Stalked by the Kraken, and this follows a witch who owns a bathhouse where they extract sex magic from the walls, and she is currently doubting her matchmaking abilities after like a bad ex situation. She crosses paths with a kraken who is like instantly besotted, but he's also a treasure hunter, and so he has a job to do in chasing down some treasure. It is like a cute story. Obviously, like it's hot, oddly touching in parts, and I think that was where I was kind of delightfully surprised by this. I'm only a little bit embarrassed to admit that I think this has put it in my veins level. Like it was really entertaining, but it also like it made me cry. Which is so funny. And also why I've read 2 more books in the series. I will recommend it for those who are kind of dabbling in monster smut. I wouldn't say that I'm a connoisseur of this area, but I think it's got exactly what you think it has based on the title. But it's also got some heart to it as well, which is nice. Deceived by the Gargoyles, however, it's basically a librarian mated with a gargoyle pack, but they're basically a werewolf pack. And if I'd known that, I probably wouldn't have read it. There are 3 guys in this with the one librarian, and there was one who actively sucked. Basically, the plot starts when he tries to like date her, but is not telling her that he's part of an existing like polyamorous triad. And there is one of the other gargoyles is like kind of all right, but they're like, they really don't develop their relationship at all. It's just kind of like, oh yeah, they're instantly like good together. And then there was one where there was any actual tension to the relationship. So I don't know whether to give this one the skull, because it was also silly long for what it was. Like it went for way too long. I think I'd recommend this for the werewolf pack girlies who like an alpha, because for some reason this had that. Entranced by the Basilisks did not do enough to repair the damage of the Gargoyles one, and also wasn't as good as Kraken. So it didn't win me over, but it was like a big improvement, I think. There was more of a sense of humour with this one, and the love interests, of course the basilisks, were I think much more likeable to me. They end up helping a human woman who gets turned into a sort of gorgon, I think it's gorgon, like a Medusa, through a rare serpent book. So like there's a bit of fun there. And I recommend this for people who like, I guess, rarer monster smut, with a bit of silliness and brooding thrown in there. I still would say this is probably not my cup of blood, but I didn't hate it. A Werewolf's Guide to Seducing a Vampire. I promise I don't only read supernatural romances, but this is one of those. It's about a shy werewolf who owns a garden shop in a magical town and then buys a crystal that he doesn't realize actually contains a vampire succubus who has been kind of kept like a genie in this crystal for decades. or centuries, I think. So this is a continuation of an existing paranormal romance series, and it really feels like it. There's so much about the other secondary characters that I didn't know them because I haven't read the others in the series. So I might recommend it for those who like light small-town magical romances, but I think you probably want to read the other ones first before reading this one. And so because of that, it was not my cup of blood. For a change, The Princess Trap has actual humans in it. We follow a woman who I think is like an admin at a charity organization. Because he's there to offer money, she has an encounter with a prince from a foreign land. Because of the paparazzi catching them in their encounter, he suggests that they're actually engaged, and she flies out to his castle to continue the ruse, for the sake of his reputation, and also because he gives her money, which she needs, because I think her sister is very sick or something like that. It's a pretty sweet story. It's kind of funny. It has that thing where you like have secondary characters who also have a bit of a thing for each other, and you're like, oh, that's so sweet. It is surprisingly smutty though as well. Like, I don't think you expect that level of smut, but it's a nice time, and I think it's second tier for me, and I recommend it for people who like either the fake dating trope or all of those romance movies where people end up with like the prince or the princess. A Lesson in Thorns. All right, so some of these are truly stretching the definition of romance. I think technically this one falls into erotica. This is quite a strange book about a group of friends who've returned to a place called Thorn Chapel. They've all been sort of haunted by this place since they were children, and they were all there together. Weirdly, this book is described as, I think, fairy tale, like a fairy tale-esque. I don't quite know why, but I think it's just kind of got moody vibes. It's got a castle or manor, and there's discussion of like pagan rites and traditions, all tied in with like a really, really smutty story where everyone kind of wants each other, and there's like BDSM as well. Like, honestly, I was very glued to this one, and I think that people who like soap opera drama type relationship tension will like this story as well. It has to be an I'll bite because I read it in like 2 days. It was so quick. Feast of Sparks is the sequel to this. This one, it was bad. It was rough. I can't say much about it, like the contents, because it's a continuation of the first one, but it has some like flashbacks that feel uncomfortable because the age of the characters and the things they're doing in the flashbacks feels weird. It has like a really strange storyline to do with a murder, and then there's like this whole thing where perhaps their parents have done all the same debaucherous shit they have in a generation behind them, like at this same place. It's really weird. Yeah, but it was also like kind of a drag. Like, I think that was more frustrating to me, was like there was so much discussion that felt unnecessary. There was so much jealousy that the first one didn't have. And it's like, why do you suddenly have all this guilt and jealousy that you didn't have in the first book introduced in the second book in this way? It felt weird. So tonally, like, it was off. It's getting the skull. I think it has to get the skull. It is probably like my second to least worst book of the year, behind Skyfall or whatever the other one is called. Yeah, I'd recommend it for people, I guess, who liked the first one, but then have really low expectations and they just like the characters enough to continue their story, I guess. From here, we will move on to another of my lowest rated books of the year, and that is The Beholders. And partly this is expectations, and for some reason I thought this was a gothic story, and I don't think you can call something a gothic story just because it takes place in a historical old house. And also it was called a thriller, and I don't know that you could call it that. It was not thrilling. God, I wish I could say so much about the story, but yes, it is a historical fiction with an absolutely gorgeous cover that follows a maid as she is working at a manor with various secrets, and her life is recounted through her diary. So this is an epistolary story. I'm not quite sure how to say that, but it's basically told through a series of her journal entries, and she admits at the front that she doesn't have experience writing, but then everything she writes is so descriptive that it doesn't make sense in the narrative. With the mermaid story, like, it's a strong emphasis on the prose because the perspective is from the mermaid, who is a little bit, I don't know, inhuman. This is told from the perspective of a maid who apparently has never written things before, but then is incredibly like so much. Her ability to recount everything, incredible. However, it's really, really boring. So we know at the start of the novel that there is a court case for the death of the son in the home of like the lady and lord of the home, but it takes a long, long time to get there. The part of the book where you're just learning about her maid duties or her servant's duties, it's just so much of it, and ultimately it affects very little, if not any, towards what actually happens in the rest of the story. Why have we gone through so many days of her recounting things that do not matter at all? You can't have a book that is that boring and then have the third section actually have content and then be like, oh yes, this book is good because like it really gets there at the end. No, it was really badly structured. Sorry, I get like worked up about this particular book. Yeah, this was a big skull for me. And I guess I'd recommend it for people who have exceptional patience, but I also want to give a warning because it wasn't in the start of the book. So I guess this is spoilers, but also I think it's frustrating when you don't have trigger warnings for content like this. So there is sexual assault described in the book. And not only did it frustrate me that it wasn't in the trigger warnings at all, but it was also the first time it felt like something actually interesting happened in the book. And then that made me angry as well. Because I was like, I can't believe that I'm like excited something is finally happening and it's this upsetting. All right, so All Systems Red, ending on a good note. This novella follows Murderbot, who is a bot who has gained control of their governor module. So it's working with the crew that it's been hired to work with, not hired to. I guess it's kind of gifted as part of the package as like a bot. But it can do its own thing, and it uses the hacked governor module to watch TV and like have a little independence and kind of do some things to save some of the crew as well. So it's really a story about connecting with people, and I think it has a real sense of humor, which is quite fun. And yeah, so I'd recommend it for people who like light sci-fi with a bit of a humorous tinge, like a bit hopeful as well. So I think I would put that in I kind of like put it in my veins, or I'll buy it. I think it's put it in my veins. Like I didn't really have many complaints about it. It's not the sort of thing I read a lot of, but I thought it was really good. It was a good time. But yes, I believe this has been incredibly long enough as it is. If you have read any of these books and have opinions on them, I would love to hear them. Particularly if you've disliked the ones I've disliked. I would love to complain some more about any of these. But yes, I will leave it for now. And yeah, I am really excited about the books that I am reading in the second half of the year. I'm already partway through The Buffalo Hunter, I Who Have Never Known Men, and something else. But yes, I will probably do an end of year recap as well. But yeah, this one's been long enough, so thank you for listening. Please put below any of your favourite books or least favourite books of the year. I'd love to hear them. Thank you for listening. Bye.